And this is the second part of our Baltic talk about fisheries and TAC. And so maybe it's better if we start with a short recap.
Right, of what we said last time.
Yeah,
right, so we spoke of TAC and quota, because this is the regulation that everyone talks about, or the TAC and quota, everyone says that. But it's actually two things. So TAC is the total allowable catch that you decide on a sort of sea basin level. So the Baltic is the total amount that you can take from there. But the quotas are the national parts of the TAC. So, and then quotas also within each country becomes divided up to different players. So the TAC and the quotas. So the TAC and quota regulation, as we said last time, it's something that is decided between the member states and the Commission upon a proposal from the Commission. So the Commission lays out their proposal. This will be the annual fishing TAC for next year, and they do it with support of course, the EU rules in place, but obviously also with scientific input. So they get scientific input from an international body of scientists called ICES, so they get that every year. So there is this annual cycle of TAC and quota regulation that they set the TAC each year for the coming year. So it's an annual thing. So it's repeated every year, and it takes roughly 6 months, the process, so to speak. So it starts usually in May, and then in the Baltic case, we have a decision somewhere down in October. So.
Okay, so this was the recap.
Yes.
But so now the next part is about what is the problem with TAC?
Yes. So last time it was just about the process and how it works and the players and everything. Just basically explaining the setup, because most people don't know the fact that it's not known is not strange, because most of this happens between closed doors or behind closed doors. Member states negotiate. Although we as NGOs and other stakeholders can influence, we're not actually present, and nothing is live like this when they negotiate in public. So that's a thing. But yeah, so what's the problem with tax? And I mean, anyone looking at this from the outside probably would say the same thing. So what's the deal? How hard can it be, basically? You have the facts, you know the status of the stocks, you need to set a TAC at a sustainable level. How hard can it be? Well, it turns out it's very hard. And it's sort of hard because of several things, I would say. And I'll come back a little bit to how things could perhaps be done differently later. But so the process I explained last time and just now made a quick recap of is a part of the problem, actually. I mean, it's the process leads to the dark side, sort of, and it's sort of the way it works with negotiations. On paper, it looks like a straight line, basically, from science input. The Commission develops a proposal, they get the stakeholder input, they look at that, they cook a proposal up, the member states look at it, and voila. But all along in these steps, there's lobbying activities, or well, we're lobbyists too. Of course we are, but everyone is pushing their national interest or individual interest into this, and it creates confusion. It creates insecurity in politicians. They don't know where to go or in what direction. But like I said, it leads sort of to the dark side, because there's negotiation on every step of the way. So if you start here, negotiation goes on to push it here and here and here and here and soon outside the camera. Historically, we've had some terrible experiences with this. But so the negotiation part is partly already in the scientific community. There's also scientists don't agree. We know that, and science is not. This is not an exact science. We cannot count every fish in the sea. So they do their best with the data we have. Of course, they use quite advanced modeling. They use input data both from the fishery and their own scientific surveys. So they have a lot of knowledge, but obviously nothing here is perfect, and the fishermen sometimes quite rightly point out that a lot of the times the knowledge is sort of already old. I mean, the survey was done this year, but they use the data for the assessment of the stock next year.
Okay.
I mean, because they can't do it like today, and then tomorrow we have it takes time. So there are time lags in the system, making it a bit difficult. Things sometimes change faster. But anyway, within the science community, there is a part also negotiating already there. So sometimes scientists would go into a room saying, obviously all the data we have indicates that basically this fishery is collapsing, we need to stop it. Someone else would say, well, no, that's not the indication we have. And so there's obviously a discussion based on, a scientific discussion based on what do we know, where should we go, what is the precautionary and reasonable approach in light of the rules that we have in place. What can we advise for this fishery? So there's a sort of a negotiation going on. Okay, voila, there is an advice that's discussed already quite at some length between scientists. So already here, we've perhaps had a situation where some scientists feel that we should be more careful, but it's already here. Okay, then it's presented out in the open. Then the commission looks at that. They get all this input from stakeholders and whatnot. And they have to also think about, the rules, of course. They think about socioeconomic factors and impacts. Maybe we need to go further down, but this is a drastic move, so we can't really do that. So they raise it a little bit too, sometimes. It's not all the time. And then, obviously, it's then put to the member states. And they fight for their national right to these tax, meaning the quotas in the end. Again, you put another layer on politics, so to speak, and negotiations on this. So the tax sort of, with this process to the dark side, it leads to a situation where there is this slow push of the tax upwards. And if we go back historically, this is easy to do. One can see advice from the scientific ICES groups is extremely rarely followed. So it's quite often a completely different approach in the end chosen, and negotiations going on. And this is surprising to many people, and to many in the NGO community indeed. But we have a state of the stock. Something is bad, something is good. We need to work with that. We need to react, and not accept to put all these other layers on it. That's politics. That's how things work. Negotiations work. It is a disturbing fact that the quotas rarely sort of end up where they sort of supposed to be. So this is what I meant with leads to the dark side. It leads, in our case, most of the time to too high quotas, basically. We in the Baltic, we have a situation for at least some of the stocks that we simply don't have. We cannot play around anymore. We have stocks that are sort of losing it, basically. The Eastern cod stock is the best example of this, where the TAC and quota, like I said last time, is the primary tool we have for regulating our fishery. And it is extremely strong and powerful if it's used in the right way. But for the Eastern Baltic cod, we're almost at the time, or we are past the time, where the quota isn't really working anymore, because the quota that is given out, say, last year and actually the past 4 or 5 years is not even utilized. They're not taking it out. They can't fish it because the fishes are too small, or they're concentrated in areas where you can't fish for them, or there's simply no profit in it because the fish, again, they are too small or not valuable to the market. So we are sort of losing this tool's usefulness regarding this. So we simply need to sort of move beyond the TAC and quota regulation, and then this is sort of one of the obvious problems with this as well. If it loses the ability to actually regulate the fishery, something is seriously wrong. But okay, so a main problem of all this is this negotiation at all levels, basically, and where we take into consideration things that perhaps isn't right from an ecosystem point of view, but from a socioeconomic point of view or not. But this is why many of us, or many people looking at this, even my kids, when I ask them, they just say, but they say we should fish that much. Well, let's just fish that much. Again, it's not that simple.
Yeah.
So
it seems.
Yeah, it seems. Yeah. But this is basically it. There are procedural problems, there are negotiations, and there are steps along the way that basically sort of by default presses the quota in certain directions, and political will and political strength to actually step aside from this is an issue. And like I said, we're losing the ability to actually use this tool. And if we are, and we're constantly saying that then is not enough, then we need to do more. So that's basically the limitations of the TAC and quota is quite clear. It's just that, but what else then is sort of the question.
Okay, so how do we change this process and situation then?
Yeah, I mean, okay, so the process, our simple approach is basically, we need to follow the scientific advice. We don't think there should be, or there's no room sometimes for negotiations. The TAC and quota, and like I said, and I repeat this all the time, we manage our stocks with tax. That's extremely important, and we will continue to do that. But we come to a situation where it's not enough, or it's not even working. Then we need to do something differently, or we need to add things. We need to do more than just that. But our simple approach, clearly, even my kids know it. Can we just follow the scientific advice? At least try that. That's the first step. But we actually have, which is the interesting case here, we have in the Baltic, in our small little world. I mean, the sea is vast and everywhere. As you know, this isn't the green planet; it's the blue planet. But our little world, our little Baltic. Even here we have both extremely bad examples and actually some kind of nice examples of how it could be done differently. So I already mentioned the eastern cod stock, but the cod in general has been overutilized for a long time. We used to fish several 100,000 tons of cod in the Baltic. Cod was everywhere. Now that was an extreme situation actually for a while, that we had so much cod, and probably the Baltic has historically, and I talk about, geologically historical times, it never had that much cod actually. So it was perhaps unnatural in a way, but we obviously had a much better situation than we have now. But we have overutilized it, and we are now, like I said, at a situation where even cutting the TAC dramatically might not even change. It might not even help, because the cods are simply too small, they're starving, or whatever it is. We need to do other things. So we need to have a clear path towards finding relevant closed areas. Fish stock recovery areas, actually a term present in the regulations. We perhaps need to reconsider how we fish, not just where and how we fish. And quite frankly, I think we also should, raise the question of at what point are the cods more worth alive in the ocean than actually taking it out? Because cods have a place in a crucial part of the ecosystem as a top predator, basically. And without the cod, the sea won't work. So, good example, I said. So the bad example of the eastern cod stock, I'm just saying it now, that it won't even matter this year or next year almost where we put a TAC. Because it's not sort of limiting the fishery, and it doesn't seem to have any positive effect on the stock either. Or obviously, we've never tried to completely stop fishing. Well, we tried during the war a long time ago. After the war, both wars, we've seen. We've known historically that fish stocks were quite abundant. Obviously, no one was fishing; it was kind of dangerous. But so we haven't really done that. That's one thing we have never done. So perhaps, sure, that can be done, but what has been done in one small part of the Baltic, which is the straits between Denmark and Sweden, the Öresund Strait. So this is a small, narrow strait, which has cod in it, of course. It's what we call the western cod stock. There are two separate management units and stocks in the Baltic for cod. And this stock in this particular area is both in better health, meaning that they're both old and young and large and small, and more abundant. So, counting area sort of wise. So how's that? Well, it seems to be quite clear that one part of this issue is how much we're fishing for it, or the way we fish for it. Because in this area, trawling has been banned since the 1930s. So there's basically never been an active trolling going on in this region. And that's not for conservation purposes. That's basically because this is an extremely busy area with shipping, and so we can't really have trawlers moving up and down there. But we have a very extensive fishery. There's a lot of angling, recreational fishing going on, and there's also obviously commercial fishing using nets and traps. So, but we clearly see a different composition of that stock compared to other stocks and areas in the Baltic. So this gives an indication of something is doable regarding how we fish. So there's really terrible situation for the eastern cod stock, where we currently are in the position where probably reducing attack won't matter. Then we have this small example where we've already, for other reasons, taken decisions to not use certain gears and not use certain fishing techniques and keeping the fishing pressure to a certain level, and it seems to work. So there's these both bad and good example at the same time. Now, another good example of trying to move away from this very variable TAC and quota regulation up and down, and partly as a reaction to this process that I said that led to the dark side, is the Baltic salmon. But it's an example as well. So basically now, since 2013, the salmon TAC in the Baltic has more or less been stable. It's been around 100, and this is not in tons, so it's in salmons. So it's 100,000 salmon that can be taken from the entire system and then divided up by quota. So here we've had a situation where the science has been fairly stable of saying that, yeah, we can probably fish on this level, and the ministers and in the council in Baltfish and in the also the representatives from the commission has been acting very stably. They've been saying that, okay, we hear and see the advice, we see some positive, perhaps, and some negative trends, but we keep the TAC level. Yeah. And they've been doing that, and they have also added some other measures. They have changed the way, some countries have partly changed the way we fish, so we've reduced certain types of fisheries out in the open sea, moved it closer to the river mouth, so we know what stock we're fishing from. The salmon is different, as you know. We have many individual salmon rivers, and each one is an individual genetically unique stock. So this is one of the major difficulties with this particular species, that it's not just one stock, so we just need to limit the fishing or increase the fishing. We need to think about individual rivers. But anyway, since they have been keeping it stable, and I wouldn't say low, but at least stable, this has meant both for the fishermen quite, they know the TAC is going to be this much. It was last year, it will be next year, a good situation. But also, it seems to work for the stocks. Many of the stocks have responded very positively to this. We've seen actually some record-breaking numbers in some rivers of returning salmon spawners in the past years. However, the ministers and the commission have not been tricked into raising the quota. Although we see positive development, they've been sort of not rocking the boat. They've been, setting the same level, keeping a close eye of development. But for example, this year, very hot summer, as you know, very dry. We don't exactly know the situation, what it will be this year. But for example, last year, it wasn't a fantastic year. The year before was better, and then bad, and then better. So we've had both up and down, but we keep this quota level. And it seems to work. And it seems to work not just for one river or two rivers, but for a few or multitude of rivers. Not all rivers, and this is a difficulty. Some rivers clearly need more work, probably upstream work, even more protection of the cods, the salmon, I just say, than we have currently from poaching, illegal activities, things like that, upstream also. But we see positive development, and this is an interesting example of what perhaps could be. So, following advice, being strict on how we implement the TAC and quota regulation is probably wise. I mean, the direct comment of how to change it. I mean, I just said that this negotiation and then this political or politicizing this process is a problem. So one way to change it could be simply to take that out. Why should we politicize annually a process to set quotas? Why? We have, it's not 100% comparable, I know that, but we have hunting, right? Now hunting, we don't have a situation where politicians either in Sweden or in Lithuania sit in the parliament and look at advice and they say, well, maybe this year we can take 15 deer and 28 moose. Yeah, okay, good. Let's do that. Of course not. They don't do that. There are experts and there are agencies that work with this, and they look at the situation out there. They decide on quotas, if you like, for hunting. This is how that is done. We set overarching rules, as politicians set overarching rules and ambitions for where we need to have, this and that animal, or if this is a problem or not, or that's how we do that. Why? That could be a thing also, of course, in the fishery world. Why do we set this on an annual level? And especially when we get situations where the quota goes down and then goes up and then down, and this is not good for, probably not the ecosystem, and certainly not for the fishermen, because they don't know. It's a complete mess for them. So the salmon case, I just said, that's very interesting, because it is this very flat line, hopefully on the right level for the stocks to improve, individually. But regarding the other stocks, how about it? I don't have a finished proposal for that, but it clearly indicates the path towards the dark side clearly indicates that this negotiation isn't really helping. And there's something there. I don't think politicians or we as the general public, as citizens, should be feeling threatened by, okay, we can't decide each year about where's the democratic process and blah, blah. Now, the democratic process will be there, but more of an oversight of saying, okay, we keep our level, we say this is a relevant TAC, we keep that stable. And if things dramatically decrease or gets worse or even improve, we take stock of that. But maybe if they don't dramatically or getting worse, we can probably still keep it, maybe one more year. But if it continues this way, we probably need to go down to have slower fluctuations. That would be, I would say, an ideal situation maybe. But as I said earlier, some parts of our stocks in the Baltic perhaps cannot afford to wait for that or to have that, unless we really put it at a very low level. But that's one way of seeing this, that this politicized, highly politicized process is perhaps not useful and it's not helping. But our main, and I think my final closing remark regarding what we should do and how we should change this, I mean, the TAC and quota regulation is, like I said, one thing, but it's not enough. So we need to do more things. And I think we need desperately to move away from keep focusing and looking at individual fish stocks and quotas and seeing the ecosystem's needs instead. So what I mean by that is, well, to put it in concrete terms, today, we work in different forums and groups and agencies and experts with basically the environment and the ecosystem. But fisheries is not there. Fisheries is separated, and it's treated like a separate entity, almost, that it's sort of on top of everything else. So we basically have every ecosystem part here and then some fisheries over here, but they don't really work together, or they have a separate minister for that, and the others work on everything else. Everything from climate change to plastic to oil spills to everything is done over here, but fishing is done somehow in isolation over here. And that's not how the ecosystem works. If nature would work, I mean, that's not how nature works, so it shouldn't be how we work. So I think this is a crucial part. Good environmental status for the sea and the fish stocks in general should be the general aim, not to find a specific, TAC and focus on that annually, all the time, instead of looking at the wider picture and finding a relevant level for the tax that we can live with or handle, but perhaps try and keep it more stable and not shift it around too much. Like I said, we will, and we have already found ourselves, we are in the situation where we perhaps don't have the luxury of doing what I just said, but for some stocks we could. For the Eastern cod stock, we are really in a dramatic situation where the TAC and quota regulation simply does not seem to be sufficient. We need to do more. We need those fish stock recovery areas. We need perhaps to move a fishery, we need to differentiate the fishery between gears and time of year, and potentially we even need to go drastically down that path of doing what we've never really done, which is completely close a fishery or parts of the fishery, and obviously having a plan for how do we sustain the people that live off fishing in the Baltic during that time, because we see the end result is just, it's getting worse and worse and worse. We don't see any kind of light in the tunnel. And the TAC and quota clearly won't manage this. So a lot of things at once. but I think, at least here and now, since we have the situation where we have the TAC and quota regulation, they're focusing on that, they do this separated, although they should, we at least need to make sure that we do follow the scientific advice, and certainly when we are in a dire situation. That is the first and foremost. And then we must add other layers of protection and other layers of management of the stock for both the ecosystem, but obviously if we want to have a fishery in the future. I think it's quite clear to everyone that we're not doing okay. We're not even doing better than we were yesterday or the day before. So that's the situation.
Yeah. Maybe we can...
Too tragic to end on a Friday.
But maybe we can have 30 seconds. What is CCB doing?
Good. Yeah, we can do that. Yeah. So on all this, well, I would say the thing I mentioned about this part, that treating fisheries in isolation somehow between or separated from any other ecosystem consideration. I think that's one of our main aims, to try, and in all the environmental spheres that we are active in, for example, within HELCOM, or if we talk about the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, or even the Water Framework Directive, because some fish, as salmon, for example, swim upstream and out again, and eels obviously also live in both on sort of inland waters and the ocean. To try and in the environmental sphere talk about fisheries, and in the fisheries sphere try and talk about environment. So we participate and work within different spheres, but we try to connect these dots, and we try to put forward the idea of what we need to focus on is the ecosystem health in general, not meeting a certain line that's called maximum sustainable yield. We continuously fish on that line. We should probably be well below that line, not to keep pushing the stock so hard, but we should do it for the ecosystem as a whole, for the needs of the ecosystem. And we need to do it uniformly. We cannot keep this separated. So that would be the overarching thing. But on details, I mean, obviously we work from everything from upstream work regarding, for example, salmon, to do restoration efforts and remove dams, things like that hinder salmon to reach their spawning grounds. That's a very practical sort of end point of it, all the way up to policy discussions with both, government officials and people in the Commission. But the overarching ambition is to find ways to go beyond the TAC and quota regulation, to manage things in a smarter way and a more uniform way from an ecosystem point of view. So I am, for example, personally chair of one small working group we have in the Baltic Sea Advisory Council. One of the players I mentioned the last time in this whole TAC and quota circus, that's called the Ecosystem-Based Management Working Group. So there we try to address some of these other issues, also influence the fish and fisheries, of course, but my ambition is to heighten, to bring up the level of the discussion a little bit beyond just the TAC and quota. And I think we got a good chance of doing that. I think ambitions such as trying to form a uniform vision for where we all want to go, both fishing interests and NGOs. What is it? What kind of sea do we want in the future? That is an ambition and approach from our side, and we hope that we can, within, for example, the BSAC, but also within HELCOM and other forums that we work, to be able to perpetuate this idea that this is where we just have to go. Again, like I said, that's how nature works, so that's how we should work. So that's it. But I feel I have to say something positive. It's Friday, and this is very doom and gloom. But I think I've been working with it for quite many years, and I do see, positive developments both within the fishing sector, but also within the administrations and the Commission, of more, I'm not going to use seeing the light, but finding the impossibility of matching ambitions in one legislation with the other, because they just clash over, for example, fisheries. And if everyone's seeing it and are willing to try and loosen these knots up and try to improve the situation, well, then we are moving in the right direction. So unfortunately, in October, where this year's TAC and quota will be decided, we will again be disappointed. I'm quite sure we will. But we are, like I said, at the point where I hope that the TAC and quota regulation isn't just the one and only thing that we keep talking about, but instead say, okay, fine, set the quota there, but it's actually other things we need to get working on, get busy on. And I think not least for the fishing sector themselves, because they can't have a up and down situation, so it's not a good thing. But the weather is nice at least, and it's Friday, so
thank you for watching us.
Yeah,
enjoy your weekend, and
yes.
I just want to remind you that more info and latest news are on our website, on our social media, so follow us. And if you have any questions, please write us.
Yeah.
So thank you, Nils,
thank you
for today.
Yes,
and see you next week for our next
talk. Yes, and also we should say, don't forget to send us ideas or things you would want us to talk about.
Yes,
that we maybe know something about, but not can't be sure.
Yes,
but do that too.
Of course. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a great weekend.